Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. Learning. Every practitioner is a learner. They're learning primarily in action. But in order to accommodate the changing circumstances in which one's practice brings them, there's a learning challenge and a learning outcome to be determined. Peter and I have this conversation pretty much devoted to a practice of learning that's, we think, is somewhat built into every other kind of practice there is. And we hope that you will agree when you finish listening to this conversation. As we continue delving into the nature of practice, learning keeps coming up over and over and over again in regard to particularly the challenges one finds as they seek results in ever-changing contexts of their practice. So I'd like to devote some of our conversation, if not all of our conversation today, to the practice of learning, and maybe we can add into that mix how preparation, particularly higher education, which is our bailiwick, affords more effective learning practice as they graduate, or maybe even works against effective learning practice upon graduation. So a lot there. But you gave us a book called Learning as a Way of Being a few years back. And in that, one of the chapters that I remember has to do with learning challenges. So perhaps we could start talking about that and then see how this weaves in bigger discussion.
Okay. Well, in that context, in that chapter, I'm talking about the learning challenges that particularly someone who is developing themselves for managerial leadership and can see a little ways down the career road a succession of opportunities and positions that will involve continuing application of their leading ability, and that furthermore, they will, as you just said, they will find themselves in continually changing contexts, sometimes changing contexts, changing with almost violent speed and unusual character. When we were talking earlier in an earlier podcast, I've forgotten now which one it was, fourth or fifth, I was talking about this idea I have about permanent whitewater. Permanent whitewater simply being a vivid metaphor for the nonstop change, sometimes often chaotic change, that leaders in all walks of life are encountering these days. And the key thing about the permanent whitewater idea is novelty and surprise and messiness. That is, when the bottom dropped out of the parking lot at the Atlanta Marriott, the hotel manager couldn't call up his director of potholes, sinkholes, and take charge of the process of dealing with the sinkhole in their parking lot. No, what he had was a mess. He had to recruit from the people he had some kind of a team that would deal with all of the different problems that the loss of your parking lot, perhaps the permanent loss of your parking lot, creates. And similarly, when angry parents confronted the superintendent of schools in the New Jersey school district over the teacher, the substitute teacher who was using voodoo to control students. You don't have a director of voodoo studies to call up and say, take charge of this problem. You don't have a director of unusual religious practices. I don't know what you have, but what you have is not going to map very neatly onto the problem of the angry parents who want to get the voodoo teacher out of the classroom. So you have to make it up as you go along. uh, out of that messiness. And out of another interesting characteristic of whitewater, Peruvian whitewater issues is they demand attention. They can't just be put halfway between the in basket and the out basket to be dealt with later. I think I told this story of the new Protestant chaplain who was pulling patients out of the bed in the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York and having a come to Jesus seminar there in the patient's room. And when you hear about this as the executive director, you don't just say, "Okay, well, we'll take care of that later." You take care of it now. In the particular instance that occurred, the individual delegated it to the chaplain in charge of the unit that month. Perfectly reasonable act. But that chaplain in charge now has got this hot potato on his desk or in his ears or whatever. So surprise, novelty, messiness, obtrusiveness, demanding attention now. And another interesting characteristic that I've run into constantly is that these matters are all matters of perception. They're not existential. That your unsolvable, net messy problem is my interesting challenge, and vice versa. So permanent whitewater is a perceptual force in an individual's environment. I've had people in seminars stick their hand up and say, "I wouldn't have it any other way. If I didn't have a half of a dozen of these on my desk at a given time, I wouldn't think I was doing my job." Kind of an instinctive firefighting mentality, which is perhaps an essential job qualification for this world we live in. But in any event, so learning challenges are occasioned by the fact that your environment is just never going to hold still.
I think that word "now" is so important, Peter. Now, and you cannot defer for more than a few moments when you're in the thick of it. And it's that moment of now, here I am, this thing just happens, what do I do? That you mentioned mapping on to that moment is what you know so far. That process of quickly retrieving from wherever the heck we store all this stuff, putting it on and seeing if there's any edges that we aren't covering with our current ability to perceive and do. So am I kind of making too much of that, or?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
We know very little about what I'm talking about, and I certainly include myself.
Well, that's a good part of it.
And
we don't know a lot, and we need to know a hell of a lot more because there's a lot of nows going on out there right now.
And what it is we know very little about, I think, is this notion of learning challenges. I won't say I've done a lot of reading in the psychology of learning, but what little I've done, I've never encountered a concept like this learning challenges notion. As far as I know, it's relatively original. And whether original or not, if it's somebody else's idea, I'd like to be able to give them credit.
Yeah.
But original or not, it's real.
It's real.
And the learning challenges of learning calculus are not the same as the learning challenges of learning to play golf, as you're discovering.
That's right.
And as I used the example, I think in a text to you the other day, learning English constitutional history is yet a third learning bucket of learning challenges that includes reading a lot of very dry, very old English exegesis, I will use that word, on the law and justice and how the English system has evolved. All is taught by a wonderful man who was a fount of wisdom and knowledge on the subject of English constitutional history. However, he never said two words about what we were all going through reading the books that he assigned.
Each discipline from our world, the academic world, does seem to present a somewhat commonly shared way of teaching and learning. You started at the beginning of this conversation to talk about preparing managerial leaders, about whom we've spoken in earlier podcasts. It was clear, I'm sure, that you were preparing them for action. You were preparing them to get out there and work at the forefront of their organization, wherever they may be, and handle the churn and the chaos and the surprises. But other disciplines tend to prepare people to read more constitutional law or, appreciate the knowledge that's available, which is all well and good. But the worm is turned very much in the direction of what are you going to do with whatever you pay money to learn in college once you're out in the so-called real world. So even folks teaching those more esoteric subjects are feeling the pressure from their students as well as from the environment. They're in a whitewater situation to make sure that the students can come up with some ways to use the theories and exemplars to which they're being exposed. And I think that sort of goes back to the question of learning practice. Teachers can put it out there, even try to make it more sticky, but it's still up to the learner to see clearly that there's something there that they can put into their life and eventually put into use. So this is sort of a classic issue. What are your thoughts on that? Sticky theory and students who want to be stuck.
Well, yes. It seems to me that the learner has to have some objectives or at least broad purposes that help him or her to get through some of the more frustrating moments in their learning process, whether it's a book to be read, very dry text to be read, or a lot of traveling on the road, going out and doing interviews as I did for a year in my doctoral work. And there were times when I wondered, what has this got to do with anything? I'm just a gopher for my senior professor. And I'm doing his interviews for him here in northern New Hampshire, where it was so cold one time that my steering the gear shift lever broke off in my hand as I went out to make the 7 a.m. shift at the Brown Paper Company in Berlin, New Hampshire.
I know it well. And where I raised our kids was 50 miles away from Berlin, New Hampshire, on a colder side. So, but you're right. Now here was this Tom Sawyer kind of thing here. This painting this fence is really fun. Why don't you do it?
Yes.
So the professor may have hooked you on that, but also particularly the rigor of dealing with all those challenges to get to brown paper and talk to people. That to me was building your practice as an observer, as a listener, as an interpreter of what you see into what eventually could become theory, and in many cases did. So that was a practice unto itself, but it took grit to stay at it. And maybe that's one of the things we do in academia is we reward that kind of diligence.
Well, just to continue that particular experience, I knew why I was up there, and I knew what the learning was when a paper machine, which is about the size of 2 city buses laid end to end, a paper machine running at 200 or 300 feet per minute, a 12-foot wide roll, the paper breaks, and paper is then coming off at 200 or 300 feet per minute, 12-foot wide roll, and just filling up the room rather than going on to the roles it was supposed to go on to. And then I saw the 5 or 6 man team leap into action to get the paper, the torn paper, back on track. That's when I saw some teamwork.
Yes, sir.
And that's when I knew why I knew then why I was up there. And I had at least the presence of mind to do a detailed observation of the process. I even put a hand-drawn diagram of the paper machine in my dissertation.
Wow.
To try to capture the situation that presented itself. So a lot depends on the learner's thirst for knowledge, so to speak.
Sure.
But not completely. It's an interaction that the learner has with others in his or her environment who can help or hinder that learning process. And of course, the instructor is, or the trainer, or if we're talking about a corporate environment, is in a key position to help that happen.
It's about needing to be in the proximity of people who can help or hinder. That goes along with the learner's intention to learn in action, that who's available and has a particular need to help that person get through that learning challenge. I'm thinking about your experience in the paper mill with those spontaneous learners, and particularly the fact that you derive from those observations looking at action as novelty occurs. Yes, paper machines used to break back then, but never the same way twice. So they had to quickly diagnose and then jump in. I know that in my years working in the proximity of paper companies in Western Maine, there was a tremendous loss of money when those machines went down. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars an hour. And so the alertness, the confidence, the competence of the persons you observe was a key factor in their success on a day-to-day basis. You then took in that real-time learning, observing people doing things on the spur of that moment, and eventually put that together into a dissertation, among other things. And I wonder if in that process, even back then, Peter, you were starting to model in your head how learning in action typically occurs, to the extent that you could model a process of learning that our listeners might be able to visualize.
That's true. I think that's true. I mean, I was seeing one thing I was seeing that was quite important. I didn't make enough of it in my dissertation. I didn't even make enough of it in the book, Learning as a Way of Being. But it's what you might call team learning. Mm-hmm. Or I'm now calling it interactive learning, where what you learn depends on what I learn, and what I learn depends on what you learn.
I like that.
And it doesn't do any good for me to go off by myself and learn something and then bring it back as though I was now going to plug it into the team experience, and everybody else would congratulate me and thank me for this wonderful contribution. In fact, everybody else might scratch their heads and look at me as if, what have I been smoking lately? They don't see what I see. My idea may be a very valuable one, but if I don't develop it skillfully in a team context, if I just work in private, it's going to be harder. Let's put this in process terms. It's going to be harder for the team to absorb it and develop it and learn from it and incorporate it in their way of working together. And, you and I have been teaching courses on interpersonal relationships years,
Yes.
and we have endured the smirks of our hard-nosed colleagues teaching finance and economics and marketing and the really important stuff. And only later on in my career did I begin to see that they were teaching organizational behavior too. They just didn't know it. They were teaching how people need to work together to develop, a case for a courtroom proceeding or a presentation for a advertising agency or whatever. They needed to work together. And if they couldn't work together, the job did not get done. And they all learned that the hard way when they left school, thinking that they had gone the hard way by taking all the quantitative courses and all the technical courses. They only discovered that the hard way involves working with people, and that they really didn't have anything if they couldn't work with people and engage in team learning. So I think interactive learning is a very important factor or quality here. And any of our listeners who are teaching human behavior courses in any context, schools or training departments or wherever, take a minute to point out to your group of learners that they haven't got much if they can't do it in relation to other people. And so team learning is very important.
I see two types of team that for the practitioner will continually be available to her. One is the preformed team. Your membership is established institutionally to some degree. It's expected that together you're going to solve problems that no one person alone can solve. But the other are those spontaneous emergent teams that come together usually in much more novel situations, sometimes in crisis. But somehow they pull together and they see their way clear to get something done. In both instances, what I think becomes an important skill within learning practice is to size up not just what's going on for the person, but with whom is it going on right now.
Yeah.
What do they know that I don't know? What do I know that they don't know? All of that has to happen very, very quickly. And I think there were some course formats and some class formats, like we used to use experiential learning exercises that modeled that fixed team as well as the ad hoc or spontaneous teams. But again, it was not a common practice across all disciplines, certainly even within the business school. Getting together for assigned projects on other course formats, yeah, that happened. But what we were doing is knowing that one way or another, a solo learner doesn't get very far in life. And so we were trying to cultivate that aspect of their personality where they're willing to admit something is going on they don't understand, and then attract the beginnings of answers that other people may have. It's like the difference between organized line dancing that they do down south, where everyone gets in line instantly. They know not only how to get into a line, but how to move their feet to the music. And it's a kind of a fun thing to watch as they're stomping and doing that as if with a lot of practice. But if you flip that over to another situation where all of those routines are not at all available to you, you almost have to form the dance like that and get people to harmonize just long enough to get through the through the learning challenge. I know that you loved watching both organized teamwork and also the ad hoc. And in watching those and thinking about them, has that helped you over the years, Peter, to get your very unique grasp on learning?
Definitely, no question about that. And in fact, within the idea of ad hoc teams or involving interactive learning or team learning, there's a whole spectrum of differences depending on personalities and cultures. Increasingly in the world we're living in, these teams include people from different cultures, where that instantaneous coming together is even more tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the ad hoc learning is with people you know, and sometimes it's with people you don't know, and that's a variable. Sometimes it's dangerous, and other times it's not. Sometimes it's expensive, other times it's not. Sometimes it has an obstreperous member that simply has to be dealt with before you can go ahead. And other times you're freed of that burden. So you don't. There isn't just one category called ad hoc learning or team learning. There's a whole spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are saying in permanent whitewater, with continual learning being the name of the game, of an interactive kind, usually of an interactive kind, under often very unusual conditions. Begin to put all these variables together, and you have a what do you have? You have a learning challenge for each individual, and that it would help. It would help if they had some understanding that this was the soup they were in the middle of.
Yes.
And if someone had talked to them along the way about the conditions under which their learning is going to occur, and that maybe they have something to learn about that before it actually lands on their doorstep. It can be the case that the only reaction to a situation like this, and I've actually experienced this, seen this myself, is extreme puzzlement. What are we doing here? What am I doing here?
Yeah.
What's my
Why
role?
me?
What are our objectives?
Exactly.
Why this set of people? Who put this thing in? Who's in charge here?
Yeah.
Where the person just has just a bunch of unanswerable questions. Maybe they would be answerable if you had enough time, but they're not answerable in any short period of time that this team has available to it. And so I just would argue that learners need ways of thinking about the learning process and about their own learning of the context that they're going to be operating in, and that they can be helped to develop these while there is still time in a quieter, more reflective learning environment, whether it's called a classroom or a library or a study group or whatever it's called. I don't think that in the world of higher education, those opportunities are being taken advantage of. I don't think learners are being encouraged to work to understand the learning challenges they're in the midst of, and that they will be in the midst of in the future. And I think the reason for that is that so many instructors themselves do not have a useful way of thinking about learning challenges, about the learning process, about the learner's learning future, and instead are just really able in the moment to impart their particular there are particular morsels of wisdom that were prepared for this particular occasion on this particular day.
They call it material, as if it's
yes, right.
A tissue or something, or cloth. Here, let me. I've got to present my material.
You've got to get through the material.
I got to get through the material, and you're evaluated. Did you use all 14 chapters of that textbook? I can remember being asked that once, and I said I will faithfully make sure that all 14 chapters are considered. But that was the way it was, and it became even more so as we hit into this new world of delivering coursework on technology. It was less and less about being present with students as learning came up, challenges or otherwise, and being able to do, as you witness in that paper mill, see somewhat from an observer position what was going on and make a contribution and make a diagnosis from the standpoint of what you could take into the next lesson or the next lesson. That kind of presence of that one person among others who has that obligation to look after the learning is what I always thought was being a teacher. And therefore you can do it anywhere, anytime. Just like you do, I'm sure, in your circumstances, you can see the teachable moments and you can offer a support to the people in your presence so that they can make it through. So we're talking, a little bit abstractly, but not really. I'm restating that. Abstraction makes it easy for that traditional teacher to, in quotes, deliver material. Because their defense is, well, I don't have to make that bridge. I don't have to build that bridge to practice. That's the student's responsibility. Okay. Teach esoteric stuff, but is it the student's responsibility totally to build that bridge between theory and practice that we've talked about throughout these conversations? What do you think?
Oh, I was just sitting here. You sent me off into a little memory of how many times I have heard from individual instructors that they take care of that in the Capstone Course.
Oh yeah.
They take care of that whole problem of what does it all mean and how do we integrate it and in the Capstone Course.
Yeah.
What happens actually happens in the Capstone Course is that the professor of that course then teaches his own theory about business or whatever it is.
That's right.
And doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to the learning experiences the students have already had and to what other learning experiences might be available to them.
Yeah. That's an awful concept, but it's everywhere. It's everywhere in every kind of business school. And now it's, they can do it with technology. But it's funny because when you said that, my first thought was, well, the rest of their life is a capstone course. I mean,
that's very well put, Dave.
The left ear life is a capstone course because you're constantly integrating. We just talked about the high wire act of in a moment when you need to pull a team together to get through the knothole. If someone has some marketing insight, if someone can crunch numbers, if someone can understand the customer experience, if someone has a notion about a particular tool that could be put into the mix, that's what we try to do in these capstone courses. We say, okay, you're from all kinds of majors, but we're going to integrate. We're going to present some business situations and see how you can pull together and come up with some really, sound projections of what should be done. Well, that's what we do for the rest of our lives. So there's an interesting disconnect between the notion that you're capping off your learning and getting graduated, and something else goes on after. Well, there's my 20 cents worth.
Well, it was amusing to me that right away when I said capstone, right away you sat back and got like a big smile on your face.
Yeah.
And you clearly communicated, oh boy, where have I heard that before?
Yeah.
And yet our experience has never overlapped. We've never been in the same school at the same time. No. I've been in 5 different major teaching relationships in 5 different schools. You've been in however many you've been
3
in.
or 4, yeah.
Yeah. And so the notion that we take care of that problem somewhere else is endemic in the culture of the schools that purport to teach MBAs and BBAs about business and management. You know, throughout this discussion, we have one of our earlier podcasts was about the digitalization of the world.
That's right.
And I think we need to note that everything we're talking about has been transformed by the process of digitizing the learning experience, digitizing the objectives, digitizing the qualifications of the instructor and of the student, digitizing the material to be covered. There's very little left in the learning processes we're talking about, where the spontaneous and emergent and softer softer processes in the learning process.
That's right.
That the whole thing has been subject to measurement and to creating a stiff and not very resilient structure within which to impart all of this wisdom. And it's going on here at a rapid pace, as you and I have been retired and not really seen the full force of it. I, in particular, who retired a few years earlier than you did, not really seen the full force of it. Web pages for courses were just coming in 2008 when I retired. And so I don't really know what it's like now to be as thoroughly structured as it has become.
Let me give you a quick image. I'm sitting in what the university calls the media center. There's video studios, and I've been getting a lot of help on how to record and edit podcasts. Years ago, when you and I, you were at UConn, we were both at UConn, there used to be a room where you could get a projector, remember? And roll it on a cart into your classroom so you could have it threaded, usually by a student, and so you could show a movie. And that was about the extent of what they called technology in teaching and learning. Be able to show, some kind of a Harvard case movie that they used to have, and students could get a little bit more excitement as far as a visual experience as they were processing. The Bob Knowlton case. Do you remember that one?
I think I do, yeah.
Yeah, it was a Harvard case, and they turned it into a movie. And I used it a few years when I'd get my projector at the classroom because I wanted the students to have something more animated than me. And the funniest part, it was done in the early 80s. And Bob and his wife slept in twin beds. And one of the students raised their hand at the end. I said, what do you make of this? And the student said, why are they sleeping in twin beds? And I said, because you couldn't film people in the same bed. Husband and wife.
Yes.
That was the norm. And that became much more of a lesson in some ways than the Bob Knowlton case per se. But I guess I'm rambling along to say that those are the media footprint in everything around technology to support learning was a room somewhere in the basement of our classroom building. Now it's a big presence, and most courses are on Blackboard and all the rest. Here's the point, though, that really touches my heart. Being present when spontaneous learning occurs. When I put my bio together for our webpage, I'm going to say that I have to be a witness to people learning something that we agree is important to their future. I have to witness it. It's just the way I'm built. I can't stand the notion of being removed so much that all people are getting from what I do is something I'll never see. So I'm kind of greedy that way. And I think the way you structure your courses when I was in them or observing them is you like to be there to see what they'd come up with. When you give them a quick problem to solve or a little exercise, you were eager to hear how it came out because that stimulated you. Is that what we're talking about, teaching for practice? Really? Is that what it's about, teaching for practice? Because we love practice more than we love theory. I'm ready to confess that I like theory a lot, but I love practice because I like to see people doing stuff and getting better at it.
Well, I think I'm the same way, although I have to confess that it's only since I have begun to focus on practice as we call it, a big P practice, practice as a phenomenon in the learning environments of people that needs more attention, which we've been trying to give it here in this series of podcasts. Prior to that, I think I had that same need to witness breakthroughs and aha experiences, but I didn't call them practice. I don't know why I didn't call them practice, but I didn't really link it up quite that way. I wish now in retrospect that I had, because I have witnessed a lot of aha experiences in my career, and I wish I could have been on the spot to help the student connect that aha experience to their future. But that is just part of my own development. I didn't see it very clearly in those years until the latter part of my career.
See, there's a difference. We could witness a moment that people break through, and it's sort of casual. But when we witness a breakthrough moment with people who have the intention, which we call leading to practice, that intention to produce consistent results, then you can really make that link, because you're aware as a supporter of that person or those persons that there's a pattern ahead of them that they're going to follow to get better at whatever the practice is within the big P scope. So we are kind of moving into concluding our time by saying that while all learning is pretty damn wonderful, the learning that can be linked by the learner and the person supporting the learner to a practice is likely to produce more what we call the learning practice abilities as they go on, because they can see that leading and learning and practice are all infused in their intention to achieve results. Do I have an amen?
I used to, amen.
Do I have an amen?
I used to often call those Eureka experiences also.
Yeah.
And I had a professor one time who was teaching the work of Carl Rogers and the trying to understand people from their own points of view rather than being locked up in your own personal point of view. And in class, he said one day, if you ever see the world as another person actually sees it, it will change your life forever. And subsequently, that same semester, I had pretty close to that type of experience myself in some of the work I did for that course. I saw it in some of the other students, my colleague students, and in particular, I've seen it repeatedly over the years, that once people get it, that there is another point of view than their own, it comes sometimes as a shock, but it usually it usually settles down into a warmer, more compassionate frame of mind. But it isn't the only, by any means, it's not the only Eureka experience that one can have. And they do come as a surprise. Some of the books I've written, in fact, I remember I believe in the preface to Managing as a Performing Art, I confessed that half of the material in this book came to me as I was writing the book.
I remember that very well.
And so,
I loved it.
Somebody came up to me, I believe it was one of the women students, and she was quite indignant because her concept of a book was being an author of a book was that you were supposed to develop all this knowledge, and then the book was unrolling it in
after the fact,
in some kind of final form. Yeah, and so for me to have confessed that writing the book was a learning experience, a constant learning experience, and that subsequently became quite true of the second book also, offended some people that they didn't want to hear that they were just receiving my latest insights.
Boy, what a counterculture we're into today. People are not going to, they want it now. They want what your thought is now. I mean, look at all the commentators that are out there right now in the middle of these investigations, all the talking heads. Everyone wants you to process in real time and sound as profound as possible. And that's the good ones. That's the ones who really are intent on offering something of value. So, but the practice of writing that book within your larger practice brought ideas to mind. The practice of creating these conversations and recording them and putting them out in podcasts have changed, I think, a lot of what I believe about the nature of practice and my own self. I'm a changed man, Peter. I really am. I'm a better man than I was when we started this collaboration months ago. So let's reserve some more growth for the next podcast conversation.
All right. Yeah.
I think we've grown enough for today. Huh?
Limited store. Parceled it out.
But in summary, what we've attempted today, and I think we've succeeded in doing, is take this really, I can't even find the adjective for the subject of learning in real-time action, and we've given it full deference and respect, because we realize that among the ways that people have organized their lives, sometimes in schooling, there's a whole lot more situations that they're into where learning has to occur on very different terms and at a very different speed, and sometimes with a higher risk and reward than anything we've been able to construct in academia. So, to all of you who are listening, who are out there making a living through your practice by constant learning, we tip our ancient hats. Final thoughts, Peter, for this one?
Well, way back when you were talking about the 16 millimeter
the movie projector,
millimeter projector, the thing that I remember vividly, maybe this will be true of you too. The thing I remember so vividly was that every film we had seemed to be called an ERPI classroom film, and I wondered and wondered and wondered what that word ERPI meant. ERPI, but I never found out. But it's engraved in my memory. ERPI classroom films. That was the extent of the high tech in the classrooms of our childhood.
I'm going to ask Siri on my phone. I'm going to ask Siri, what is an ERPI? She'll produce a dozen websites for me to look
Well, I
at.
assume it's some kind of an acronym, but
I'm sure it is.
I don't know. I don't know what it is.
There's no one working here at this university right now who was in our media center when I came here in the mid-'80s. If they were, I'd be able to step down the hall and knock on the door and say, "Hey, Roy, what's an ERPI?" And he would know instantly. But Roy's been retired a long while. So, folks, you have been listening to an ERPI podcast by Peter Vale and David Firo.
Be careful. You not knowing what ERPI means, we shouldn't attach it to our podcast quite yet.
I know, and if I have one, I'm seeing a doctor right away.